deathbed. Free of any fear of reprisal, Severus' brother laid out in stark detail the crimes and ambitions of Plautianus, and this time, with the denunciation coming from an even more trusted source than Plautianus, Severus finally changed his mind. So when Caracalla contrived to flame Plautianus for attempted assassination, Severus was ready this time to believe the charges, even if they were complete fabrication. In January 205, Caracalla went to a few centurions in the Praetorian camp and convinced them to interrupt an imperial banquet with forged proof that Plautianus had ordered them and 8 of their associates to assassinate Severus. Cassius Dio relates the absurdity of the plot by saying Plautianus would never have dared to impose such a bidding upon 10 centurions at once, certainly not in Rome, certainly not in the palace, nor on that day, nor at that hour, much less would he have written it. But Severus, already stewing over his brother's words, was in a mood to believe the worst of his former favorite. Plautianus was called to the palace and confronted by the emperor. In the midst of the prefect's denials, Caracalla, perhaps fearing the denials would be all too believable, since they were, after all, true, rushed forward and struck Plautianus in the face. He then drew his sword, but was prevented from killing the prefect by Severus, who ordered that the deed be done instead by a nameless subordinate. Plautianus then, like so many hubris-ridden Praetorian prefects before him, was unceremoniously executed and his body thrown into the streets. As a nod to their once happy partnership, Severus eventually ordered the body retrieved and buried, but the dead prefect's property was confiscated, and his family, including Plotina, were exiled to Sicily. When he finally became sole emperor in late 211, Caracalla made good on the promise he had made, and ordered all of them, especially his hated ex-wife, strangled to death. Following the death of Plautianus, the succession issue became in one sense more clear, and in another, more cloudy. The likelihood that anyone would be able to stand between the sons of Severus and their birthright was now almost non-existent. That much was the clear part. What clouded the picture was the bit about the sons of Severus, plural. In the mind of their father, the joint rule of his sons would be the best possible state of affairs, so that's how he wrote up his will. But it seems hard to understand how he came to this conclusion. Apparently in his mind, allowing the boys to become co-Augusti would eliminate the odds of a bloody dynastic struggle flaring up. But in this, he had it completely backwards. Everyone knew that Caracalla and Geta hated each other. There was simply no way they would be able to share power peacefully. They were oil and water. If Caracalla said up, Geta said down. If Caracalla said go, Geta said stop. If Caracalla rooted for one charioteer, Geta rooted for another. The only way to elicit an identical answer to a question would be to ask them, is your brother worthless? Because both would answer a scornful yes. A dynastic struggle. Severus' plan of joint inheritance guaranteed it. Whatever fraternal bond the boys had shared was finally shattered by the execution of Plautianus, the hatred of whom had been about the last thing they shared in common. The death of the prefect is also blamed for a, loosening of morals on the part of the boys. When he was still wielding his very real and very threatening powers, Plautianus acted as a psychological check on the sons of Severus, keeping them directly fearful on the one hand of the prefect, but also indirectly fearful of losing favor with their father, who could always turn to Plautianus if he caught wise to the fact that his boys had far more in common with Commodus than they did with Augustus. Both Plautianus gone, it was time for the teenagers to let it all hang out. Who else was their father going to turn to? Disdaining any real responsibilities, both boys became obsessed with chariot racing, drinking, gambling, and everything else that happens in the wee hours of the morning. The ironic thing is that when you got right down to it, they were pretty much the same terrible person, even if hinting at this fact was liable to get you killed. Severus watched all this with alarm and began to despair for his heirs. He also began to despair for himself. Plautianus, however personally unscrupulous he may have been, had always shielded Severus from the mundane details of empire. But now that the prefect was dead, Severus found himself snowed under by a staggering amount of paperwork. So it was with great relief that he greeted news from Britannia in 208 to the effect that the natives there were getting restless. Here was a chance to kill two birds with one stone. The distraction of a good old legionary campaign would do wonders for his own mental health, and hopefully the rigors of military life might whip his wayward sons into shape. So he dug Caracalla and Geta out of wherever they were sleeping it off, and happily informed them that they were all going on a father-son camping trip to Britain. The boys, now 19 and 20, were appalled at the idea of fighting a war in the frozen north, but their father could be a very persuasive man, so off they went. Next week, we'll follow the Severans on their family bonding trip to Britain, where, among other things, they will attempt to exterminate an entire race of people. Their genocidal aims will be halted only by the death of Septimius Severus in early 211, whose passing, further, gave control of the empire to Caracalla and Geta, who will go down in history as a pair of Commoduses, to match the one Commodus Severus had once upon a time criticized Marcus for not smothering with a pillow. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment, with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going there, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, so you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of their monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend a book that came out a few years ago called Caesar's Legion, the epic saga of Julius Caesar's elite 10th Legion and the armies of Rome, by Stephen Dando Collins. I think the title pretty much says it all. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 102, The Common Enemy of Mankind. Last week, we left off with the imperial family packing for their camping trip to Britain. You'll recall that in 208, Septimius Severus had seized on a relatively minor military uprising as an excuse to get himself and his sons out of Rome for a bit. Getting away from the capital would, for Severus, mean getting away from the banality and pettiness of government, while for his sons, it would mean getting away from the temptations that they had been all too recklessly indulging in. They were the co-heirs to the throne, and yet, so far, at 19 and 20, they knew far more about chariot racing and what the best kind of hangover cures were than they did about, say, running a multi-ethnic empire with mortal enemies surrounding on all sides. Like many a stern father who had to struggle for every dollar and honor that he had ever won, Severus was afraid that his sons were turning out soft and unserious, and he knew just how to cure that. A good old-fashioned military campaign. Up at dawn, Spartan meals, lots of marching, sleeping in tents with the ever-present threat of violent death hanging over your head. Yes, sir, that was just what the doctor ordered. They arrived in country in 209 after having raised a new legion to help them wage what Severus hoped would be a strenuous, but not necessarily difficult war. After all, the emperor was at this point looking to add one more great victory to his resume before dying, so in picking to go out fighting in Britannia, it is probable that Severus thought the deck would be pretty much stacked in the Roman favor. And to further that point, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that this would be Severus' last campaign. he was suffering from the effects of old age, and in particular, an onset of gout that required him to be transported in a litter everywhere. His doctors could not have been pleased that their patient was planning to go marching around Britain, but Severus, ready after a long and trying life for the sweet release of death, was no doubt looking to die with his boots on. The particular natives in question who had gotten restless were a confederation of Caledonians living beyond Hadrian's Wall up in modern-day Scotland. But ever since Albinus had dragged the British legions away from their post, they had grown bolder still. Now, Severus had not neglected to set things back into place following his victory at Lugdunum, but still, Hadrian's Wall was crumbling and now manned mostly by new recruits. Severus and his sons arrived on the scene with backup, including a newly raised legion, a bunch of Gallic auxiliaries, and an offshore fleet to keep the Caledonians cut off from outside trade. And in mid-209, the Romans advanced north of Hadrian's Wall for the first time in a long time. They marched around doing their level best to draw the Caledonian army into battle, but there was just one problem with this strategy. The Caledonians refused to fight. Well, it's not that they refused to fight, it's just that they refused to fight in a big old battle that would look spiffy on another Severan triumphal arch. Instead, the Caledonian forces scattered to the hills and embarked on a classic guerrilla campaign. They sprang up out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, picking off isolated Roman companies, harassing supply lines, interfering with communications, and generally making life miserable for the legions. Severus was looking for one last shot at glory, and what he got instead was a 2-year war of attrition against an enemy he could never stop from poking him in the head whenever his back was turned. Enraged at his own frustrated impotence, the emperor responded to all of this by ordering genocide. The legions marched back and forth across the country, destroying whatever villages they came across, and killing every man, woman, and child they could find. Severus was mostly hoping his campaign would provoke the regular Caledonian forces enough that they would come out of hiding and battle him in the open. But if that didn't work, well, then eventually the Caledonian race would be exterminated, and where the Romans made desert, they could once again call it a peace. But Severus would never get the chance to finish the job. While planning the next phase of his extermination campaign, the emperor's real wish was finally granted, and he died after a brief illness in February 211 AD. Septimius Severus was 65 years old, and we say that he ruled the empire for just about 18 years, even though his claim to the throne had been hotly disputed there at the beginning. The final campaign in Caledonia had been a disaster. The Romans had lost something on the order of 50,000 men, and the Caledonians, while somewhat chastened, had by no means been brought to heel. The only lasting benefit of the war to the empire was that along the way Hadrian's Wall had been reconstructed, a project that led later Romans to call the wall the Severan Wall rather than Hadrian's Wall as we know it today. But really, Severus could have just ordered that done without having to waste all the blood and treasure his war in the Highlands had just cost the empire. But speaking of that, I guess there was one other benefit to the failed campaign. At this point, the Romans stopped trying to conquer Scotland, which was probably a prudent move. As for Severus's other suspected motive for starting the war in the first place, so that his sons could have some sense beaten into them, well, that didn't work at all. Their friends back home were relieved to find Caracalla and Geta emerge from the war no worse for the wear. They were just as